Thank you very much. And thank you very much I'll stand.
Oh.
Thank you very much for organizing this and inviting me, and thank you for coming along, especially on a beautiful day like this when I'm sure everybody would prefer to be outside. I talk about communication in the medieval kingdom of Hungary in the context of multi-ethnic society. Hungary included a mixed society of diverse groups that spoke different languages and arrived from different places. Apart from those adhering to Catholic Christianity, Eastern Orthodox, Jewish, Muslim, and for a while so-called pagan populations also lived in the realm. Such linguistic and religious variety was a result of a long development and of many waves of immigration. Over the centuries, Eastern steppe peoples, including Pecsenyeks, Kumans, Yasyans, also Slavic populations, German speakers, Romance speakers from the Walloon area, from northern France, from Lorraine, from Lombardy, called Latini, Gallici, and Italici in the Hungarian sources, and others arrived and settled. Chronicles in the 14th century reflected on the diversity of the immigrant populations and their intermarriage with Hungarians, listing Bohemians, Poles, Greeks, Spaniards, Ishmaelites or Saracens, Pecsenyeks, Armenians, Saxons, Thuringians, those from the Meissen and the Rhine, Cumans and Latins, saying that they, through contracting various marriages, mixed with the Hungarians and obtained nobility and possessions alike. Well, obviously not all of these people obtained nobility, and not even everyone intermarried, but it gives you a sense of this diversity. So in such a society, how did people communicate? A methodological caveat is necessary. Often, there is no way to ascertain the veracity or otherwise of narrative accounts. So we have some pragmatic sources where you can actually sort of see what was going on, but then also narratives which may be completely fictional. That people must have communicated is clear. How they communicated is often much more difficult to ascertain. But even when specific narratives about direct communication may be the invention of their authors, they at least reflect what people at the time thought communication could achieve, and the stories that they wove around the impossibility, so possibility and impossibility of communication across linguistic and religious divides. Although such a mixed population and more modern cases of multilingualism in ethnically mixed societies make it likely that multilingualism facilitated communication in many instances, actual historical traces of such multilingualism are rare in medieval Hungary. Multilingualism appears explicitly in some of the medieval texts as a positive phenomenon. A very famous text, King's Mirror, attributed to Stephen I of Hungary, who ruled from the end of the 10th century to 1038, and most probably written at his court by a cleric, a text usually referred to by the later title of Admonitions, encourages the addressee, the king's son and heir, to welcome foreigners at his court, and puts in the king's mouth, as justification for this, a sentence, "For a kingdom of one language and one custom is weak and fragile." The author was most likely an immigrant cleric himself. In 1414, Sigismund of Luxembourg, king of Hungary, also of course king of the Romans and an emperor, who himself spoke several languages, reportedly opined that Hungary provides a pleasant abode for both natives and newcomers with its diversity of languages and peoples. In 1490, Petrus Ranzanus, who was the provincial of the Dominicans of Sicily and an envoy to the royal court of Hungary, where he was commissioned to write a history of the realm, wrote of multilingualism in Hungary. In his work, the Epitome Rerum Hungarorum, and various versions of this title exist, he wrote that Germans have settled in Hungary and Germans and Hungarians speak each other's language. Apart from these more general statements, multilingualism can also be seen in action as a means to ease interaction between groups of different languages well established in the kingdom. The need for multilingual communication was embedded in urban legislation. In some cities, even council members were elected in a proportion that was to reflect the composition of the town. So, for example, in the late 14th century, in Zagreb, Slavs, Hungarians, so-called Latins, they're Italians, and Germans. In Žilina, Slavs and Germans were elected as councillors. Further, the documents and town books also used both languages. In Buda, there were German and Hungarian council members, although only conflict and royal intervention led to more parity. So in the end, there was a 100-member electoral body consisting of 50 Germans, 50 Hungarians, and they were supposed to sit one German, one Hungarian, one German, one Hungarian. There are also examples of German summaries written by contemporaries on the back of Latin charters. So, for example, Sales of Estates, where somebody in the vernacular kind of wrote the gist of it on the back. These cases demonstrate a pragmatic use of different languages in order to ensure smooth governance and legal transactions. The law book of Buda, which was compiled in High German between 1405 and 1421, prescribed that the judge, jurors, and notary, when ending their period in office, make a speech, first in German, then in Hungarian, thanking the public and asking forgiveness from anyone they may have unjustly angered. I was vaguely wondering whether we should try to reinstate this. Likewise, it dictated that both German and Hungarian-speaking citizens gather together in front of the town hall to select one person to thank the judge and members of the town council at the end of their term. Then they must take counsel on how to elect the judge and council members at a following meeting in a court. A charter from 1360 specifies that the parties appeared before German and Hungarian members of the town council in Visegrad. There are some other regulations in the Buda law book where groups are characterized by language, Deutschen, Ungarn, and this serves as the basis for rules meant to keep social harmony. One of my favorites, market women should be 2/3 German and 1/3 Hungarian, according to this law book, including those who sell fruit, vegetables, cheese, chicken, and salt. There is some evidence about communication not only between speakers of different languages, but also between adherents of different religions. Jews used Latin in written communication with Christians, while Hebrew and vernacular written with Hebrew characters, that is Yiddish, was employed within the community. Communication in writing between Jews and Christians also included Hebrew clauses in Latin and German charters. In credit contracts between Jewish lenders and Christian debtors, such clauses acknowledged the fulfillment of the conditions and the repayment of the debt. There are also cases of one party signing in Hebrew to attest to what was set down in writing, so the signature is in Hebrew. This suggests that either Jewish or Christian communities, or both, did not necessarily see either Latin or the German vernacular alone as sufficient in legal dealings. It was more reassuring to attest to the agreement, to attest that both sides understood it, if Hebrew clauses or signatures were included. So-called responsa, she'alot uteshuvot, that is, decisions by rabbis on specific cases submitted to them, also give some insights on communication between Jewish communities and Christians in the Kingdom of Hungary. 3 texts in the responsa of Yehuda HaKohen ben Meir, who died in 1070, that survived in a later collection from the 13th century, relate to a dispute between two Jewish men. They're designated by fictional names, so we don't know who they were, but it concerns the minting of silver coins at the royal mint, for which they received permission from the Queen of Hungary. Both men claimed to have spoken to the Queen directly to make arrangements. Their dispute arose from their conflicting interpretations on the issue of who gained the permission from the Queen. Therefore, they took their case to the rabbi. They do not describe the actual conversation with the Queen, but clearly indicate direct contact and negotiation. Whether they spoke through an interpreter or had a language in common cannot be ascertained, especially because the Queen in question has not been identified. So it could have been a German-speaking or a Slavic-speaking queen, so there might have been a common language, but we don't know. Recourse to the ruler by Jews is often attested in medieval Europe. Even the Jewish street was in physical proximity to the ruler's seat in many places, including Buda. Turning directly to the ruler and communication between at least elite members of the Jewish community and the king were recorded in a charter of privileges granted to the Jews in the middle of the 13th century. These privileges by King Bela IV, borrowed from the one by the Duke of Austria, probably on the initiative of members of the Jewish community. So we already have a transmission brought by the Jews to Hungary. Further, the repeated transcriptions of the charter give us a glimpse into communication between members of the Jewish community and the king. Each time, the transcription was made at the request of Jews. The earliest surviving manuscript, a royal charter from 1422, is a verbatim copy made at the request of a certain Joseph, a Jew from Buda. It contains information about the chain of transmission. Jews of Fehérvár asked for a transcript in 1256. The privileges were also copied into the registers of a so-called locus credibilis, an ecclesiastical chapter that held charters, copies of charters. In 1396, Solomon, a Jew from Fehérvár, asked King Sigismund to order this chapter to search its archives to find the Charter of Privileges. So the Jewish community somehow held a memory of a copy being held in this ecclesiastical institution. This was done, the charter was found, and it was transcribed. In 1407, two Jews from Buda and Pest initiated yet another transcription until finally the charter was copied once more in 1422, and that's the one we have. The exact channel of communication and the language used are not mentioned, but clearly there was constant kind of interaction and communication. There is also a story concerning Hungary's Muslim population and a visitor who stayed with them, directly communicating with the King of Hungary. Muslims in the medieval kingdom constituted a very small minority. At the end of the 11th and the early 12th century, they were the target of forced conversion. But after that, subsequently, there's still Muslim life continued in Hungary, and we have evidence of that until the mid-13th century Mongol invasion. The author of this story, Abu Hamid al-Garnati, was born in Granada in 1080, and he traveled all over, and he stayed for several years in Hungary. So this is the middle of the 12th century. He wrote about his experiences. Notably, according to him, he had a conversation with the Hungarian king with the help of an interpreter. So we don't know who this was, but here we have an explicit signal that the conversation was through an interpreter. In this, he upheld two Islamic tenets and convinced the king on these issues. The first was the prohibition to drink wine, and the second, the permissibility of polygyny and concubinage, because the king argued that all these are contrary not just to law, but contrary to common sense. And Abu Hamid said, well, Muslims are different from Christians. Maybe for Christians these are bad. But for Muslims, if they drink wine, they become completely foolish. They kind of give away their weapons, and they're not going to be able to fight in the royal army. On the other hand, polygyny and concubinage, wonderful, because there'll be lots of children, and all of them will be able to serve in the royal army. So, according to Abu Hamid, he actually convinced the king through these arguments. We obviously don't know the truth of this, but according to him, from this point on, the king allowed the Muslims to continue their practices, and even defended the right of the Muslims to have concubines against the opposition of Christian priests. Direct communication is portrayed here as bridging the divide entirely successfully, convincing a Christian king to protect Islamic religious practices. This is presented to be due to the skillful logic of the Muslim interlocutor, who pinpoints the best arguments to convince the Christian king's own interests. The use of an interpreter, according to this narrative, did not in any way lessen the impact of Abu Hamid's persuasive powers. Finally, there's an episode that relates to a Cuman living in Hungary. Cumans were steppe nomads, some of whom fled from the conquering Mongols to Hungary. Initially, they were attacked, left Hungary, but then they returned after the Mongol invasion of 1241-42. They provided very valuable military contingents for the royal army. They were eventually settled, and while their leaders promised conversion to Christianity, the Christianization of the Cumans was a lengthy process. Among the posthumous miracles of Margaret of Hungary, who was the daughter of King Bela, became a nun and died in 1270, one miracle details the story of a pagan Cuman called Zaitse. According to the text, he was quite well known to Christians in Hungary, and he also had a horse that had been blind in one eye for 3 years. Once, in his presence, some Christians discussed the miracles that God made when Margaret was invoked. Zaitse did not believe in the veracity of these miracles. Indeed, he derided them by saying, if his one-eyed horse regained sight in his other eye, I promised God and you that I would believe in your God. The horse's eye, of course, was immediately restored, so Zaitse kept his promise and accepted baptism with his whole family. The story represents a pagan as having easy relations with Christians, listening to their conversation and talking to them clearly in the same language. While the narrative is written in Latin as part of the hagiographical life of Margaret, the purported conversation must have taken place in the vernacular, presumably in Hungarian. The story's portrayal of easy interaction even suggests that despite the religious divide, relations were already very cordial between Christians and at least this one particular Cuman. Overall, accounts of multilingualism or the ability to communicate across linguistic divides, including episodes of real and invented direct communication, cover widely diverging cases. Multilingualism can sometimes be inferred, sometimes it was explicitly celebrated, but sometimes interpreters played a role. In other cases, there's no way to tell how the parties communicated. While many stories detail successful communication, or at least allege successful communication, communication, of course, could not necessarily bridge the divides. And of course, we know there were a lot of attacks against Jews. There was a lot of conflict between Hungarians and Germans and German speakers and so on. Communication could be emphasized to ensure peace in a town or to ensure the comprehensibility of legal transactions to everyone. But we need to keep several factors in mind when weighing up the role of communication in interethnic relations. First, religion, of course, played a crucial role, and very often it was a real kind of stumbling block in terms of communication. Second, the authorship of each source and authorial intent is an important aspect of the representations when it's not pragmatic documents but narrative accounts. So Abu Hamid's account of his own success may be a way to enhance his prestige. Power relations, economic needs all influence the success or otherwise of communication. Finally, I just want to say a few words because of the theme of the session about how references to medieval multi-ethnicity have been instrumentalized in modern politics in Hungary. In the current anti-immigrant mood, it is not the examples of medieval communication or integration that are used, but rather references to all ethnicities having been under one crown, specifically, supposedly, Stephen's crown, Stephen I. This goes back to the Horthy era, so interwar period, when these notions were developed. The idea that Hungarians were destined to lead other nationalities in the Carpathian Basin was attributed to Saint Stephen, and was and was used to justify irredentist territorial claims. The slogan to restore St. Stephen's realm and to bring all the territory back under Stephen's crown was used constantly in this interwar period. It obviously alleged the superiority of Hungarians, their ability to create a state, etc., etc. So basically today, when there are these references to this sort of peaceful multi-ethnic kingdom, it's actually rather kind of dire, and it is in the service of a very aggressive nationalism. Thank you.